Hello, everybody. Welcome to our black and white editing webinar today. In this demonstration, we're going to turn color images into stunning black and white photos using exposure. As always, feel free to ask any questions during the demonstration. Nate, my man Nate, is monitoring the chat. So if your questions are not answered during the presentation, we'll get to it in the Q&A at the end. So let's give you a little bit of information about exposure. I'm using Exposure X7. It's our latest version of our advanced non-destructive raw photo organizer and editor. It handles your full post-processing workflow in both color and black and white photography, as we'll be demonstrating in this lesson today. A little history lesson just to let people trickle in before we begin the demo is that exposure really began as what we call a plugin. It was developed to help film photographers transition from working in the darkroom with chemistry, with enlargers to capturing and editing images only digitally. So the film emulation presets that were designed for exposure were just what the film photographers wanted. And so since then, exposure has grown to become the software that it is today. So we are talking about black and white editing and specifically converting our images from color to black and white. So that's where we're going to start off our demo today. So let us get started. I am going to go to a folder of images here on my desktop. John Barclay's images. Okay, let's take a look at these. And I'll point out a couple of things as to why I'm using these images today for this demo specifically. If you take a look here in the grid, you can see that these images have very clean lines around each one of these tones. Okay, so this one's nice and strong with green, but it's green on green. So that's a hard scenario, and I wanted to demonstrate something there. This one here has a very nice blue tone up here, and then there's a couple spots that are green, and then there's a space in the front that's more brown or red, right? And so each one of these is going to be easy for us to see the changes that we make when it is in black and white. And that's why I wanted to use these photos in particular. It shows you how you can make controls happen when you're working in monochrome using exposures tools. So before we actually take our images and we convert them over to monochrome, we want to first make some basic edits. And that's really where I typically recommend that everybody think about making basic edits to the original image before we go to make any kind of edits to it. So in this case, we want to make, well, typically we always start with corrective adjustments, right? So like removing noise or lens correction, or if the horizon isn't flat and straight in the image, then we would do that work right now as well. See, that looks like maybe one of John's feet is a little bit taller than the other side. So we'll make a little bit of a tweak here to make this nice and horizontal for us. Just a little bit. Okay. And also, you'll notice that normally I say add sharpening. If you've watched any of the webinars before, typically after my processing, after doing this like lens correction adjustments, which are automatic here in exposure. If we wanted to, we can make these manual, right, here instead of using the profile, but I'm fine with the profile. If we had some architectural lines or something, some leading lines that were straight vertical and straight horizontal, I might think about doing an manual distortion correction or vignette correction if I'm seeing that and it's not being picked up by the preset. So anyway, that's going to be my lens correction here. Also, something to look for in landscape photos in particular is any fringing, right? That can happen depending on the lens that you're using or where the position of the light is and how it's refracting off the lens. It looks like we're okay here. So let's go back to other corrections that we can make. Noise reduction, again, that's something that we can do here. And I'm going to look in an area where I think I would find noise. And so I'm going to look probably in the horizon here as it fades between these tones in the back is where we're going to find some. Like I said, I'm not really seeing much in terms of noise. Now, noise reduction is being applied via a profile, but it is pretty low right now. So we can turn it off by turning off the panel. And I still really don't, well, it is a little bit more noisy in the tones in these, like you can see in the reds as the light bounces off these trees in the background here. Anyway, I'm gonna turn it back on. Cool. Okay. So we'll do our noise reduction. And now that we've applied a couple of adjustments like that, we want to think about something else that we want to do, and that's to kind of get our image to a place where it is like a lightly edited image. And what I mean is it's a neutral. Okay. So what I'm doing is neutralizing or trying to make it more neutral so that when I apply the presets, because that's typically where I would start with presets in converting, I want this image to be as neutral as possible so that when I apply presets, black and white preset, here we go. I'll open up the presets panel. So when I apply these black and white presets, it's going to be more accurate to what they're supposed to render like. So that's why I'm getting this prepared with some basic edits. So let's rename this. Oops, wrong button. Basic edits. Okay. So you see we have lens correction, we have some noise reduction. Now I'm going to open up the basic panel and just do a little bit of touching here on this shot. And I'll just hit auto. Okay, so that's giving me a little bit more contrast here in the foreground, which I think looks great. It's also giving me a little bit more drama in the sky, which I think looks nice. And I can also, if you look at it, you can see that we actually have this really nice triangle of light because of that added contrast right in this area, which I really like. So I think it might be a little touch dark for my eyes, so I'll probably just raise it up a little bit, but I really like how it's reading. It looks nice. Maybe that's a little too much. Okay, so here we are at neutral. So you might ask why I would do this, and it's a really good question. Like, why would you make these edits first? It's not that big of a deal. Well, let's make it a big deal. I right click on that image and go back to the grid view. What I'm going to do now is make a duplicate, a virtual copy of this image so that we can apply the same look and have one that has the edits to it and then one that doesn't, so we can compare them side by side. Okay. So I'm going to right click here on this image, go to create virtual copy. So now we have our copy one here. You can see it in the top on the grid, and we have our original here, the original name. So I'm going to go back to the original and I'll just reset. So now that's nothing applied to it. And then this one is our edited copy. So now let's get back to our view. I'm going to go to, there we go. There's my mouse. I'm going to go to the editing workspace. And then I want to go into single image view. Okay, single image view, just like this. And, oh, my controls are in the way right here, so I can't quite see what I'm doing. Under layout, oh, go away. I'm going to go to horizontal. Whoop. Yeah, that's fine. No, let's do vertical. Okay, so now I have both of those images being shown on my screen here at the same time. Okay. So the one on the left is the one that hasn't had anything applied to it. The one on the right is the one that has my basic edits applied to it already. Okay, so I can close my panel here and we can see them side by side, and we can zoom into different areas and compare them really close like this. So this is a really handy way of doing this type of work. I see a question, anonymous attendee. Yes, left, right keyboard instead of mouse to raise lower contrast. Yeah, if you hover over one of these, if you have a, which image am I on? I'm on this image right here. If I activate any of these sliders, then I believe, oops, nope, that. You're asking to do the keyboard instead of mouse to raise lower. Actually, the left-right keyboard, there's keyboard shortcuts assigned to each one of these edits right here. And so for exposure, I think that's D and F. Yeah. So you can raise and lower exposure with D and F, and or contrast or whatever. All of those buttons actually have keyboard shortcuts. If you go to the help menu right here at the top, you can go to the keyboard shortcuts menu, or in the help menu, click on keyboard shortcuts, and it will show you the whole list of all of the standard keyboard shortcuts and exposure. And to top it off, you can actually, what is that? Command, comma, there. In the presets panel, you can make your own keyboard shortcuts right here as well. So you can see, like when you're in the basic panel, if you want to rotate it, that's what you press Command arrow. Or if, what were we doing? Basic edits. We were on, where were we? Controls? No. General? No, it's going to be shortcuts. It's right here. I just didn't expand it. Anyway, here, tools. See, all of the stuff's in here. And you can search down here too if you wanted to do exposure. See? On the basic panel, exposure. They're all listed. Okay. Sorry I rambled there for a little bit, but it was important information. So I'm glad you piped up and asked that question. Thanks for doing that, guy. Or anonymous person, thanks. Anyway, okay, back to our conversion. Now we can apply our preset and see what happens when we can actually do a little bit of comparison here. So what I'm going to do is find my mouse. There it is. And select, I'm going to shift click. So now I have both of these images selected. See, I have this menu or this dialog right here telling me I have more than one image selected. So it's going to apply the same effects to both. So let's look at our presets. Okay. Now we're inside of exposure and we're looking at our presets. Now, there are a whole bunch of presets, and they're great ways to get going when you're making black and white edits, or they're great things to inspire you to make your own black and white looks. And that's typically what I do, unless I just use Tri-X because that's my favorite. So don't tell anybody else. Anyway, so the presets in the black and white films category are great for doing landscapes because they have a higher contrast than the ones in the low contrast category. Low contrast is usually better for portraits because it can help make skin look a little smoother and healthy. However, that can also reduce the amount of detail you have in your highlights or something like that inside of a landscape. So that's not something that we want. What we do want, I think, is to punch up the contrast so that it looks like a really sharp shot that's film, you know? That's where I think that it reads really nice and sweet. So now we know that we do have a bright image and we have a lot of blues and we have a lot of yellows. And so that's kind of like, as I'm thinking in monochrome, those are the areas that I'm thinking I can control. So I'll pick something kind of moderate where I have a little bit of sharpness to it, like this one has nice contrast. That's Ilford F 125. So nice film there. It does have grain in it, but so we can see our differences right here. The one on the left, again, that's the one that hasn't had anything applied to it. And then the one on the right has had those edits that we put there before we did the tweaking. Okay, so you can see that there is a little bit of a difference there. It is a lot more punchy, you know, but it looks more clear here, and we didn't do any sharpening. So yeah, some of that stuff there, like the haze removal, you can see that it's actually active right here in this area, and where it looks flat in the one on the left, on the right has more contrast. So anyway, so that's the type of thing that why we recommend that you would do first. Let's, I'm not going to select both of them here. Let's go back to a single image view. I just wanted to show that there is quite a bit of a difference between not applying some edits in the beginning versus applying those edits. I'm going to go back to single image view and then escape. And I want this one. Okay. So now I'm working with the virtual copy rather than the one that the original that we just have the look applied to. Okay. All right, so now we can get back to making some edits to our look to make it look a little bit better or read more like analog film, like what we want, or however we want it to look. So now we'll take a look closer at our shot and do a little bit closer analysis. So one of the things that I will do is open up the histogram. The histogram is a visual curve. It's a representation of all of the tones and the tone values in the image. So where it's higher, like in this area up here in the highlights and whites, that means that there's lots of tones in the image that are very strong in that value. And then when you get down here to the very darkest blacks, there's not all that many darkest blacks in the image, right? So that's why this is very low. So we only have some darks in this little area here and on this tree. And so that's only that little bit, okay? So as we make our adjustments now, after we've applied our preset, we're really just kind of dialing in that preset like we're doing some development in the dark room. Okay, now I'm going to undo. I'm going to Command Z, and I'm going to do it. Yeah, nope. There we go. The reason I did that, I'm going to zoom. Oh, I'll deselect that with Command D. Let's zoom back into this one. I just stepped back there. I'm going to apply that same preset. The reason that I did that is I want you to see what happens to the histogram here. So you can watch it as I apply the preset. Also, I'm going to put it in its own layer so that I can control it a little bit better. I have a little bit more control over it. Okay, so it's this one, Ilford F125. I right click this time, new layer with preset. Okay. And then you can see that it did boost those highlight values up significantly here. Okay, so before we have this, we can see where the colors are. It has blues, turquoise, there's reds there, and yellows up in that high value. And then after brings it out. So I just named off 3 different tones, and that's what we're going to do, make our next adjustments on to make this image look and behave the way that we want it to. So that's just the way that you work through when you're making some edits. This is what we're going to do is color sensitivity controls. So let's go. We can, again, hit some controls on the basic panel if we wanted to here, but we've already done that. So I am foregoing it on this layer. So I'm going to go to the color panel. You can see it's open here. Now, the color controls, the hue, saturation, and luminance controls are normally in this area. However, because we're working in black and white now, this area is now color sensitivity. So this is a really simple way that is telling you which tones you're going to adjust and make them which brightness level. So as we switch over, I'll switch this off again. We can look at the histogram. We see we have a very blue, a bright blue tone right here that's very bright or very strong. So I'm going to turn it back on, and then I'm going to look at my blues, and you can see that my blues, this value is below 0, so that means it's going to be dark. So now I want to take those blues and I'll make them even darker. You can see where they're, oops, wrong button. You can see if I move the blues down, that intensifies the dark blues in the image, which is basically in the sky, and some of the reflection here in the foreground. So that actually builds up a little bit of drama just by pulling that down a touch. Now, another place that we saw were yellows, and the yellows were very bright. And they're right, our yellows have been brightened. And so we can take our yellows sensitivity slider and drag that up to make the yellows white and make them glow. Or we can take it down to make them more blend with the image. I'm going to put it somewhere in the middle. I liked it a little bit bright, but not quite too bright. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Okay. And then the other area where we saw some very highlight or very strong tones was in cyans. And you can see the cyans are a little high right now, a little bright. If I wanted to, I could bring those down, and that's what I thought they were going to do, is give us a little bit more punch in the sky. Okay, so now this isn't an Ilford look anymore. I've done some changes to it, but that's okay because we want it to look this way for our shot. Okay. So now I've made some color adjustments, okay? So now this is a unique look, and that's kind of what I really like black and white imagery for, because you can really make a bunch of significant changes to just by adjusting the tones. Okay, so now let's start moving on after we've done some, well, actually, Yeah. So darker tones or strong contrast, that can add a pronounced texture. Okay. And so if you put a lot of strong contrast through an image like we have here with this Ilford preset, it can make things look noisy. And that's why I'm looking in here just to make sure that we don't have any kind of noise. Now, you may see that there are some grain clusters in there, but I can recognize those immediately because grain has clumps. And if you look at these, the digital noise won't have the clumpiness of this type of look in the background. Hoping that you guys can see that through the video. So one of the things that we can use this to our advantage because we do have grain through this preset here, which is probably intensifying that look, but grain in a black and white image, let's say that we don't have an image that it doesn't have very much noise, right? Let's say that it is noisy. This is not noisy. Yeah, there's no, I turned the grain off. Did you see that on this panel right here? Sorry, I didn't say that, but I turned that off here. Ooh, a little bit of noise. Okay, and now I'm gonna turn the grain back on and you can see how that grain adds that clumpy value to it. I hope that that comes through. Whereas before it's kind of even and now it's more diverse. Okay, now we can make that, we can play that up if we'd like to by making adjustments to the grain values here. For example, we can go down here to the white areas here. So these all are pretty much neck and neck where all of these amount sliders are, and that's going to show where the grain applies to the image. Now, this image in particular, there's a lot of really white whites in it. And so I'm fine with it not having very much grain in that. Oof, man, that right click button's getting me today. Okay, so, but then let's move to those mid-tone values, which would be the other part of the sky here. And let's punch those up a little bit so we have more of a grainy look, more of a crunchy grain, okay? Then I want to go down to the shadows, where we have shadows and highlights and midtones together. And then I want to bring a little bit more into that because I don't see any grain in those shadows. See, now if I crank it way up, you can see it. It's very obvious, right? So I'm going to bring it down so I just have a little touch of that. Oh, right click, little touch of that, and it brings a little bit more texture back into that look. Okay, so I'm really glad that this grain looks great. Love it. We should print this. I want to print this. All right, so one of the other things that we can do to our grain is we can add some roughness. Another thing that we can do is add some push processing. Now, push processing is something that you do, it's a film trick that you do when you run out of film or to develop it faster than it needs to be. You use different chemicals. So what we can do is add a little bit of that, and that's going to do two things. And it's going to increase the contrast in the image, and it's going to intensify that grain, okay? So I'm just bringing that up a little bit just to give us a little bit more of a punch to the grain overall. Now, if we were going to be printing this out and it's going to be very large, meaning 24 by 36 in my mind, okay? Then I would really advise that you consider which size grain that you're going to use. So a real fat grain like 24 by 36 or 135 film is typical for 35 millimeter. You know, this is what everybody shot. This is what you're typically seeing. It's that crunchy grain look. But when you start to move on to landscapes and cityscapes and bigger images, photographers used to use larger format films to capture more detail. Okay, so that is the operative word, detail. If your image has a lot of detail, then you want to select a smaller size grain. Okay. If the details in the image are important, such as people's faces or a cityscape or something like that, then I would recommend a smaller size grain. Okay. So like the detail on this person right here, you can see when I have this crunchy grain on that they're kind of unrecognizable. Now we are zoomed way into the image, granted, But if I turn that down, you can see how much that grain emphasizes, or how much that grain changes how that appears. Okay. And so once we get our grain selected, I'm going to say we're going to do this medium format, and that would probably be like 18 by 20, or 24 by 36. Big picture, right? Grain looks great, nice and pretty. So, but there's something very important that I haven't touched on. And anybody have a guess? It goes right along with grain. That would be sharpening. All right. So I'm not going to get into how film, well, I do have to touch on this. So we just applied our grain. So with that fresh in our heads, the grain clusters in analog film are what determine its sharpness. So if you have giant grain clusters and then you have a super sharp image, that won't work. It won't look accurate to real life, which is a little bit less believable. Okay. So what I want to do, since I have that medium format grain on here, I want to find some places where I can perform some sharpening to get some extra detail out of it. Okay. So there's a lot of cool stuff going on, and I want to make sure that I have that stuff and have detail and have grain on it. So I'll look down here in some of these rocks and drag my amount up here. Okay. Now, the trick on the sharpening panel is hold the Alt button. So I'm going to hold Alt and find the radius. And the radius is just how wide of the sharpening effect is going to be. So I don't want it to sharpen everything in the shot. That is not the look that I want. So I'll bring it down so it's lower. I'm going to turn the amount all the way up so it's easy to see. Now I'm going to hold Alt again and do detail, which is going to add sharpening to details. In our case, it can also do that to grain, which can make things look a little bit more, or to noise, excuse me, which can make things look more grainy. So that's why I'm going to leave that one high. Still holding the Alt or Option button, I'm going to use the masking slider now. This is going to tell me how much contrast the edge has to have in order to get the sharpening applied to it. So what I want to do is give myself some depth by adding a little bit more sharpening to the rocks and see how that goes through the whole shot. So there we go. I'm going to hold down Alt, and we can see as I drag over, this is going to be less of the shot that I'm sharpening. So I know right in here, I want sharpening to happen right in on those these little tiny leaves. I was losing that to the sky, and I want to make sure that's nice and sharp. So obviously way too sharp. I think you can see those artifacts coming from a mile away. So I'll turn it back down now to more of an acceptable amount. And this comes back to the grain and the amount of grain and the type of grain that we applied, okay? Remember when I said that the grain clusters can't be any bigger than the sharpest part of our image here. So I'm going to back up one more time. Let me go to a one-to-one view to make sure to double check. So that's that was no zoom on that. Now I see, if you look close right in this area, I can see a little bit of haloing happening there, which means it's a little bit too strong. So I'm going to turn that down a little bit more. That's better. Okay. Cool. All right. So yeah, sharpening is one of those detailed adjustments that normally I always do at the beginning of my workflow, but especially when it comes to black and white, and extra especially if you're going to be doing any kind of grain work in black and white, I highly recommend you thinking about waiting until later and doing it toward the end of your workflow. Okay, so now we're really dialing in the black and white look at this point. And so what we do now is kind of identify areas in the image that's going to strengthen the composition, bringing things forward, helping your eye to focus in different areas. And there are a lot of tricks that we have inside of exposure to do that stuff. So one of those, I'm going to add a new layer. One of those tricks is dodging and burning. So I'll select my layer here. And I'm going to use a gradient, and I'm going to use a half planar gradient. And what that does is it will control, excuse me, it will control the effects so that they fade off into the distance. And what I want to do is use that to my advantage here. And so in the layer panel here, in the layer mask, you can see where the layer is being applied. Here, there's no effects on this layer yet, but where it will be applying is where it's red, okay? So I am creating a little bit more depth by editing this portion of the image separately to the rest of the image. Now, if you remember back to when I said, when we edited the image and we put some contrast on it at the beginning, there was this beautiful triangle thing that happened with this light that comes in, and I want to emphasize that. So what I'm going to do is use my gradient tools here and follow along that light area of light, or yeah, light area. Mm-hmm. I'm good with my words sometimes, guys. All right, so yeah, that bright area. And turn it the other way because I did it backwards. So when we're working in exposure, when we're doing masking, if you watch my mask up here as I make these adjustments, where it's black, it's not having any effects being applied to that, okay? So I don't want the effect here, and I don't want the effect in the sky. I did that backwards the first time, and I apologize. Okay, so we can add a second one just by clicking on the button and then placing another one on the image. And move it out here. I think I did that backwards again. Yeah, I did. So good at this. There we go. So I'm putting the feathering edge inward toward the bright area, right? And then the other one, same deal, feathering edge in toward the bright area. So now you can see that where I've created the wedge, this mask wedge, and that will be where I'd be applying my effects, okay? And that's just to add a little bit of punch here. So I said I was going to do some dodge and burning. I'm going to do some dodge and burning. So I can just add a little bit of that was opposite. I'm going to invert that. Man, I'm doing great. Let's try this. That was not working. So let's, yeah, where it's red, it's being applied. So I had that backwards. Let's invert that mask. Shall we? Perfect. That's what I want. Okay. I'm going to go down here, add a little bit of exposure. A little bit of exposure. Not that much. And then, now remember our whites and highlights in this area are brighter. So what I'm going to do is bring the highlights down. And let me see which one's better here. In this case, yeah, that's what I was thinking. All right, so we have a lot of really bright blown out areas in this section. So what I'll do is bring the highlights and whites down a touch. But we can't have them both down. If we drag them both down equally, we're going to have a muddy mess back here. So what we want to do is still create some sort of, oops, that's not the right way. Still create some sort of contrast in there, but get our tones back under control just with a right click that I did there by mistake. Sorry about that, guys. Get it under control with a little tiny bit of whites added to bring those brighter. And then I'm going to bring my highlights down a little bit. So what I'm doing is adding contrast in this slice with both a little bit of contrast, or a little bit of exposure, and then some highlights and whites tweaks. Okay. I hope you guys can see that here. I'll turn it off. Back on. Okay. Like I still want that contrast there, but if you look in the background here after these adjustments, you can see that now I have, this looks like it's way further back in the distance, and this looks like it's way closer. So I've added some depth there in the background. What I'm hoping that would do was drag your eye better into this shot. Right now I have an axis that kind of goes in an X. right? So as your eye kind of looks down, I can see it following this one and then following this one back over here to this dark spot. So that's just what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the proportions and whatever in this shot. This is cool. I'm liking the way it's looking. Let's see if we need to do another tweak or two. Let's well, okay. When editing any kind of photo, especially a landscape, I think it's even more important with a landscape. Always check the edges of the image. Okay, so I'm going to say that this is probably something you should do toward the end of the workflow because you don't really know if you're going to crop it or how the edit's going to come out in the end. So I would save this until the end, but it is an important step. So anything right along the edge that's bright, like this little thing right here where my hand is, see it? When printing or when looking at this, if that little edge piece is super bright, you're going to look at it. Okay, it can distract you. There's another little bright one, especially right along the edges. There's one. There's one. Okay. This lady being here doesn't bother me at all, but we could clone her out. We could clone this out, you know, and clean this up so that it's more pristine. So that might be something that we can think about in our workflow. Things that stick out of the water here, we could also get those out of there, which might help your eye to, you know, lead right past that. They don't really bother me. I kind of like those in the water. This thing I think I'd take out. It looks like trash. So let's get rid of that. So I'm going to open up the spot heal tool. Now you'll see that it did something here, and I'm glad that it did that. And that's that it turned off all of the layers that are above our first layer. So since or above our crop and transform layer. So the crop and transform tool in exposure, it changes the way that the image is cropped. But because it's non-destructive, you have to be able to back that up. So that gives you a couple of different coordinate systems that you have to manage. And that's why this turns off. But anyway, so anytime that you're going to do the spot heal tool, it's fine. It just takes you back to where the original image is, and then you can make your adjustments there. So I'll use clone for this because there's texture in the water, right? And, oh, it's on blue. Blue is hard for me to see things, folks. My eyes are not what they used to be. There it is. And then we can move the place where it is sampling from very easily. So I want to blend it in as best I can with the shot. So I'm going to hold down the space bar and move. There it is. So yeah, sometimes you just have to fiddle with the placement just a little bit. And then another thing that can help is, well, after you do your cloning, right, is to make it a little bit larger sometimes, make it grow, and then feather the edge. And then it goes away. So there we go. So now let's back out of here. Oops. What is... Now let's address these ones on this edge too. Same kind of deal. We can take them out completely. Oh, where'd that go? Right there? No. We can take them out completely and replace them with something else that they'll blend. Rocks are pretty forgiving. People's faces are not as forgiving as rocks. Just keep that in mind. Another thing is that if you do have like a little piece that's right on the edge, instead of going around and cloning them all out like I'm doing here, we can do a quicker option, which is to go and turn our effects back on. There we go. See, gone. Can't even see that stuff. All those things. Perfect. But down here, we still have a couple right there on the edge. So what I'm going to do is go to our Ilford layer, because this one only applies to that section, remember? So our Ilford layer, and I'm going to put a vignette, right? Super strong, but I want to make it more square. Okay, so I took the roundness all the way down. And so here, let me turn the softness down. There we go. See what I've done? So what I'm doing here is I'm building this gradient so it just touches the edges. Teeny little bit, just right down there on the bottom to get rid of those little things for me. And then I can bring the amount of that down to more of an acceptable range. And what that does, it gives me a little bit of vignetting in the corners and such, but it also adds just enough tone to those little bright spots down there that they're not super bright anymore. So we've essentially got rid of them and we didn't really have to go in and retouch them all one at a time. So that's a nice tip for when you're trying to get rid of things right along the edges of your frame. Cool. Okay. So we're pretty good, I would say. If we wanted to do any more edits to this, I would be considering what I'm going to do with the image. Meaning, am I going to be saving this thing to social media, or am I going to be posting on my website, or am I going to be printing it? Now, I mentioned printing a couple of times, and that's kind of where I was thinking with an image like this is I want to print it. And so the next thing that I would do in particular is I would add a layer here that would be called print. Okay. Sorry, I had to wiggle. On that print layer, I would make adjustments to my tones as I print. Now, I in particular do not have a monochrome only or a six color monochrome or 6-color black or whatever that's called printer at my house. I just have a color one. And so my color prints or my black and white prints, excuse me, they do not look like this when they print. So I typically have an extra layer that I put at the top, and something that I do in that layer at the top is I will add additional sharpening if needs be after I print a first test shot out. And I would make adjustments to the tone curve. Okay. So let's see. The tone curve makes it easy to make little adjustments that will be effective to the image. And you can see what it does in the tone curve as well. So if you use the tone curve or the curve editor in Photoshop, because that's the way that you work, then that's fine. So this is typically what I end up doing when I'm doing my prints. Okay. So that's because my printer in particular that I've printed with a good 100 or 200 shots through that I liked, and then a few thousand that I didn't, is that I would raise the black point here because it always ends up rendering a little bit harder. And I would also bring the white point down, but it was only a little bit, like 99.0. Okay. And that for my printer worked really great and made my black and whites look just right. Okay. So that's just from my experience. And so I didn't want to tell you guys to do that to your own images. What I wanted to point out was make room for a layer on the top. If you are planning to print your images at the end, you may want to make some adjustments there that you don't want to have. Let's say if you want to save it for social, you want it to look like this. But if you're going to print it, you want it to look like that. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody who's argued and yelled at printers when they do printing, because you know how fun that is. All right. Well, with that said, I believe that we're done with our demo today. We've taken this color shot and all the way through the gamut of making adjustments to it and turning it into a black and white photo that I want to print and hang on my wall. So now I'm going to ask John if that's going to be okay with him. Pretty sure he's okay. Anyway, I'm going to leave you guys with a couple of comments, and then feel free to ask any questions, and we'll answer them here in just a little bit in our Q&A. That first thing is that if you want to share your work with us, we would love to see it. And a way to do that is on Instagram with the hashtag #myexposureedit. Here we go. On Instagram, #myexposureedit. That's the hashtag. Yes, there are 2 E's because of exposure and edit. But yeah, these are images that people tag us, and this is the way that we connect with people, actually. And this is great stuff to look through. If you don't frequent the Instagram, that's okay. We have some stuff over on Facebook too. Those are the Facebook users groups, and they're over there on Facebook. There's an exposure users group and a snap art users group. Okay. So with that said, thank you again for watching today and for your interest in exposure.